The desert had a strange way of delivering surprises. Most of the time, the North African sun only delivered the expected: heat that pressed into the skin like an iron, and winds that carried sand so fine it could slip into the tightest seams of engines, boots, and morale. But every now and then, the desert exposed something unexpected, something the men of the Afrika Korps didn't see coming. On the morning this story began, the surprise waiting in the dunes was American-made, and it had arrived in the worst possible way. The tank sat half buried in the sand, tilted to the right, engine still smoking faintly from the night's chaos. A captured M3, Grant big, bulky, and, in the German view, an almost comical-looking thing with its split-level silhouette and its curious, side-mounted cannon. It looked awkward, almost improvised, not the sort of machine anyone would expect to rewrite a battlefield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But the men standing around it weren't laughing, and neither was the man arriving to inspect it. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, the unmistakable signature of a staff car racing across the hardpan. Officers straightened themselves instinctively. Conversation died. Even the British prisoners, sitting under guard nearby, turned to watch. The Mercedes rolled to a stop, and the first thing to emerge was the white cap. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stepped down, brushing sand from the brim with 2 quick taps. His expression was impossible to read from a distance, but the men closest to him recognized the look. It was the one he wore when he was about to dissect a problem, piece by piece. They led him to the tank. The Grant's turret cast a long shadow over the small group. A few mechanics had already climbed over it, opening inspection hatches, tracing shell impacts, and examining the engine. But Rommel didn't wait for reports. He approached the tank like a surgeon approaching a patient brought in from a battlefield wounded, but still capable of revealing something vital. He ran his hand along the armor plate. He paused at each welded seam, and finally, he stopped at the gun, the 75mm M2 cannon mounted low in the hull. Rommel looked at it for a long time. One of his officers eventually cleared his throat. "Field Marshal, it appears to be an older American design. The British have only recently received." Rommel's hand shot up. Quiet. He wasn't angry, only focused. His mind was working quickly, pulling together known facts, battlefield experiences, logistical realities. Then he stepped back, motioning for one of the mechanics. "Traverse it." The mechanic climbed in and began turning the side-mounted gun. The massive barrel swung smoothly, the gears humming with a surprising steadiness. Rommel watched every inch of movement. He stopped the mechanic twice, asking him to repeat motions, estimating traverse angles and possible firing arcs. He wasn't impressed. He was concerned. "This gun," Rommel finally said, "can engage from hull-down position with only this much showing." He held his hand about waist-high. One of the officers objected. "But the turret sits too high, sir. The silhouette—" "I don't care about the turret," Rommel snapped, tapping the 75mm barrel with the back of his knuckle. "This is the problem. This gun is the problem." His officers exchanged uneasy glances. Rommel circled the tank once more. Then he said something none of them expected, and none of them would forget. "If the British receive these in large numbers, our Panzer IIIs will be outmatched at all normal combat ranges." There was a long silence. No one moved. The Afrika Korps had faced Matildas, Crusaders, Valentines, and beaten them with a mix of tactics and improvisation. Many German officers believed the desert itself gave them the advantage: German training, German flexibility, German initiative. But this tank, this American machine, it was something different. Rommel crouched, tapping the armor near the sponson gun mount. "The British did not design this," he said. "The Americans did, which means there will be many. The Americans build for quantity, and quantity arrives fast." Another pause. "And anything that arrives fast becomes a threat fast." He stood again, adjusting his goggles. The officers were waiting for his conclusion. Rommel gave it bluntly. We must adapt. Immediately. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He turned to his aide-de-camp. Have all units update engagement instructions. Our tanks are to flank these grants. Never engage them from head-on unless absolutely necessary. Circulate this to regiment commanders today. Yes, Field Marshal. Rommel took one last look at the tank, not as a trophy, not as a curiosity, but as a warning. Above them, the desert wind picked up. Sand hissed lightly against the armor, gathering in seams, whispering around the tracks. The Grant sat there like a giant metal question mark, and Rommel, more than anyone else present, understood the answer it implied. War was about to change again. Not because of what the British had done, but because of what the Americans were starting to send, and the man now known as the Desert Fox had just realized that the Panzer force he commanded was no longer facing the same playing field. Not anymore. The sun was climbing higher by the time the last measurements were taken. The Grant tank had become a small oasis of activity, not of water, but of curiosity, tension, and the kind of quiet alarm that officers tried not to show on their faces. What had begun as a simple battlefield recovery had turned into a strategic revelation, one that few were prepared for when they woke that morning. The mechanics finished their inspection, wiping oil from their hands, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. They climbed down from the tank, each of them wearing the same puzzled expression, the same silent question. How had a machine, this strange, this ungainly, caused so much trouble? The answer, Rommel knew, was hidden not in the shape of the tank, but in the consequences of its arrival. He signalled for the officers to gather around. They formed a half-circle in the sand, the captured tank looming behind him like a monument to an entirely new chapter of the Desert War. Rommel waited until every man was quiet. Then he began. The British have been fighting with what we call vertical thinking, Rommel said, gesturing toward the distant horizon. Their tanks do one thing at a time. They advance, they fire, they retreat, they do it in sequence. He pointed to the Grant. This, tank fights horizontally. The officers exchanged confused looks. Rommel clarified. It has two guns, one high, one low, one for the infantry, one for our armour. He tapped the side-mounted 75mm with the back of his knuckles. This one is the danger. This gun makes the Grant a threat even when the turret is pointed elsewhere. A murmur ran through the group. Rommel continued. From hull-down positions, this tank exposes only the gun. Our Panzer IEs must expose the entire turret to fire. They will lose these duels. He let that sink in. This gun is not an accident. It is the product of an industrial nation solving a battlefield problem in the simplest possible way. They bolted a cannon to the side of the tank. Crude. Yes, but clever. One of the Oberleutnants cleared his throat. Field Marshal, the turret is slow. The silhouette is tall. The armour is not particularly. Rommel fixed him with a sharp look. You are listing its flaws. Good. But you must list its advantages. He paused. Because the British will. And they will use them. The officer swallowed hard and nodded. Rommel turned to the two soldiers who had been the first to approach the captured tank after the battle. They stood stiffly, unsure why they were being addressed by the Field Marshal himself. You two saw this tank in action last night, Rommel said. Describe what happened. The senior of the two men spoke first, a corporal, with a bandage around his right forearm. It appeared out of the smoke, sir. We thought it was a Crusader at first. The silhouette was wrong, but... Rommel stepped closer. Go on. Well, we fired first. 3 rounds. 1 bounced, 2 dug into the front plate but didn't penetrate. Rommel nodded slowly. And then? The reply came fast. Sir, from a low angle. We didn't see the muzzle flash. Just the shells landing. He wiped his brow, recalling the moment. One of them tore through, Feldwebel Steiner's Panzer like it was canvas. Rommel's gaze hardened. So the first hit was fatal. Yes, sir. And the range? 600 meters. Maybe 550. The officers reacted a ripple of unease passing through the semicircle. Rommel looked back at the tank. That is within the 75 millimeters effective penetration range, he said. And beyond the safe range for our Panzer III's front armour. This was not a duel, it was an execution. Silence. Even the desert wind seemed to pause. Rommel walked to the front of the Grant tank, examining the sloped cast armour, the thick mantlet, and the oddly compact driver's port. He ran his hand over the gouges left by German shells. He knew what those marks meant. He knew what they would mean on the next battlefield, and he understood something that none of his officers had said aloud. This tank was a preview of what American industry, once it truly awakened, could deliver in enormous numbers. He turned back to his officers. Gentlemen, the Americans are not like the British, Rommel began. They will not send us a few dozen of these. They will send hundreds. Later, thousands. The younger officers looked skeptical. One of them ventured a polite question. Field Marshal, surely the Americans cannot supply the British that quickly. They are only beginning to enter the war. Rommel smiled not kindly. You misunderstand the Americans. He tapped the tank again. This is not a prototype. This is an assembly line product. Still, the officers hesitated, not fully grasping what he was implying. Rommel delivered the truth plainly. This tank is not the threat. American industry is the threat. Rommel decided he wanted to see the interior with his own eyes. He ordered one of the mechanics to open the main hatch. The metal clanged open, and a gust of hot, oil-thick air escaped. Rommel climbed up the side, stepping carefully onto the chassis, and lowered himself into the turret. The interior was cramped but functional, a tight maze of periscopes, wiring, ammunition racks, and radio equipment. Everything smelled of gasoline and scorched paint. 3 things struck him immediately. The first, the Americans built this tank with the assumption that resources were unlimited. The wiring was clean. The controls were heavy-duty. The manufacturing was not elegant, but it was sturdy, meant to be reproduced again and again. The second, the crew had excellent visibility. German tanks had better optics, but this had sightlines, windows, ports, periscopes everywhere. The third, space. Even with awkward geometry, the Grant's hull had volume, enough to store ammunition in large quantities, enough for the crew to operate without stepping on each other's boots. Rommel traced his finger along the edge of the 75 millimeters breech. This gun, he muttered to himself, was built to kill Panzers. Minutes. Once back on the sand, he called his adjutant. I want sketches of the interior sent back to Berlin, and measurements of the gun mount. Also, he tapped the turret, the British modifications. They may alter it further. Yes, Field Marshal. Once Rommel returned to ground level, the officers approached, clearly uneasy. Field Marshal, one said. With respect, perhaps we are overestimating the threat. The turret is weak, the armour is inconsistent, the tank is too tall. Surely, Rommel held up a hand. You are thinking like tankers. Think like the enemy. He pointed at the nearest ridge. Would you place this tank in open ground? No, sir. Would you charge with it? No, sir. He nodded. Good. Then neither will the British. They will place it hull down. They will anchor their defences with it. They will use it as a mobile anti-tank gun. And if they ever attack, they will do so behind a curtain of fire from these guns. His officers realized the implication. The Grant was a force multiplier, not because it was superior, but because it changed how the British would fight. This, Rommel concluded, is not a tank, it is a battlefield tool, and in the right hands, it is a very effective one. The conversation shifted toward tactics. Rommel issued new instructions with the clarity of a man planning not for the next battle, but for the one after that. Our tanks will avoid frontal engagements with these Grants. Panzer eyes will circle to the flanks. Use speed. Use maneuver. Close to short range. He gestured at the desert floor. Every battle will become a knife fight. No exceptions. The officers scribbled notes. Artillery must be prioritized, Rommel continued. We will use 88mm guns as ambush pieces. Conceal them. Let the Grant's height betray it. He took a breath. Do not underestimate this tank. Do not fear it. Learn it. Master it. Beat it. The men nodded. But they were troubled. Because Rommel hadn't yet answered the biggest question. Rommel turned away from the tank and walked toward a small rise in the sand. His officers followed. From the crest, the desert stretched endlessly, a pale gold ocean that held both opportunity and disaster. Rommel spoke softly, but the words carried. Gentlemen, what you saw today is merely a beginning. The Americans have factories larger than towns. They have steel reserves we cannot match. They have speed of production we cannot imagine. He pointed at the captured tank. That machine is only their first message to us. The next will be larger, better, and there will be many more. One of the older officers stepped forward hesitantly. If that is true, Field Marshal, how do we win here? Rommel didn't hesitate. With brains. He turned sharply. With speed, with movement, with deception. We win by refusing to fight the battle they want. We win by forcing them to react to us. He placed his hands behind his back. Because if we fight on their terms, superiority of numbers will drown us. There was nothing melodramatic in his voice, nothing grandiose, just truth. The sort of truth that commanders rarely shared with subordinates unless the situation demanded honesty. And in that moment, the desert demanded it. Rommel walked back toward the tank one last time. The officers followed, their footsteps crunching in the sand. The Grant towered over them, its bulk casting a long shadow that stretched across the ground. The sun had shifted, and the heat shimmered around its silhouette. Rommel gave the tank a final look, not with frustration, not with anger, but with respect. The sort of respect a hunter might give a worthy opponent. Then he turned to his aide. Prepare a report for OK, Rommel said. Tell them the Americans have entered the Desert War, whether they know it yet or not. Yes, Field Marshal. He paused. And tell them this as, well, Panzer III is nearing the limit of its usefulness. We require heavier armour, and a gun capable of penetrating 75mm at 1,000 meters. The officers stiffened. This was a request for a future that didn't yet exist. But Rommel was already thinking beyond the horizon. Send it, he repeated. Yes, Field Marshal. As the staff car returned, Rommel took one final look at the captured Grant. The wind was kicking up again, sending small streamers of sand swirling around its tracks. Soon, the desert would claim it. Just as it claimed everything left out for too long, Rommel slipped into the seat of his vehicle, closed the door, and spoke almost to himself. No tank is invincible, he murmured, but some tanks change the war around them. The driver started the engine. The officers climbed into their trucks, and as the small convoy pulled away, the Grant tank remained alone on the dune, the first American footprint in a theatre where none had been expected. It was ugly, awkward, crude, and yet, somehow, it had already changed the future. The Afrika Korps drove into the distance, engines roaring, dust rising behind them. Ahead of them lay battles no one had yet imagined, and behind them, resting silently under the hard African sun, lay the reason those battles would never be the same. The desert changed colours in the late afternoon. What had been harsh white-yellow under the noon sun softened into shades of gold, then copper, then a kind of muted red that made the dunes look like great sleeping animals stretched out under the sky. But the men of the Afrika Korps knew that beauty in the desert was only a disguise, especially on the evening after Rommel's inspection of the captured Grant. The air felt different, filtered, heavy. Word spread quickly, faster than orders usually travelled, faster than rumours typically moved. Soldiers whispered about the strange new tank with the American gun. Mechanics repeated, The Field Marshal's comments about the Grant's low-mounted 75mm. Radio operators speculated about what the next battle would look like, and somewhere in that uneasy atmosphere, that desert twilight filled with half-spoken worries, something else was spreading too, a sense that the next British attack might not resemble the ones before. Not anymore. That night, Rommel's headquarters was unusually still. Maps were pinned to makeshift tables, lanterns flickered in the warm wind, and the smell of coffee mixed with dust. Officers moved from one tent to another, quietly exchanging updates. Rommel sat at the center of it all, studying a large map of Gazala. The position markers, small wooden blocks with painted symbols, were arranged more carefully than usual. He had shifted Panzer Regiment 8 slightly to the south. He had moved anti-tank positions in a subtle but deliberate pattern. He had reordered artillery priorities. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just adjustments. Fine-tuning the kind a master might make when tuning an instrument before a difficult performance. He leaned over the map, hands on the table, brow furrowed. General Bayerlein approached. "Field Marshal," he said quietly. "Signal intercepts suggest the British are preparing a coordinated movement tonight. Several armoured formations have been repositioned, and we believe," Rommel didn't look up, "that their new tanks will be used?" He finished. "Yes, sir." Rommel tapped his finger against the location where the British might emerge. "Good," he murmured. "Then we will see how they intend to use their new weapon." Bayerlein hesitated. "Do you expect them to deploy the Grants offensively?" Rommel shook his head. "No. They will not charge with them. They will anchor their defence. They will use them like mobile gun positions to break our approach." He straightened. "Which means," he said, "we will not give them a direct approach." Afrika Korps gathered near their vehicles, forming tight circles around officers who read out fresh orders. The directives were clear. Panzer crews checked their ammunition. Mechanics tightened track bolts. Commanders briefed their gunners on new firing angles. One sergeant, a veteran of every major desert action since 1941, muttered under his breath, "If the Americans want to help the British, they could have at least made something smaller." Another replied, "Or slower." A third, leaning against the side of his Panzer III, said, "Doesn't matter. If Rommel says flank it, we flank it." There was no bravado in his voice, just acceptance. They all felt it, the shifting weight of the war. Just before midnight, the desert trembled. It started as a faint vibration, like distant thunder rolling across the dunes. At first, only the sentries noticed. Then the tremor grew stronger, spreading under the sand like a pulse. A moment later, radio operators heard the faint static, bursts of encoded British transmissions. And then headlights, faint, filtered, shielded by canvas, but visible to trained eyes. The British were moving. Columns of infantry trucks, armoured cars, Matilda infantry tanks, Crusaders, and unmistakably a handful of high-silhouette tanks with a split-level profile. The Grants. They moved deliberately, not in a charge but in a controlled push, sweeping across the desert in a slow, measured advance, exactly the kind Rommel had predicted. Rommel stepped out of his command car and raised his binoculars. Behind him, the desert wind caught his coat and whipped it lightly against his legs. "Look at them," he said, almost quietly. "They are testing the battlefield." Bayerlein stood at his side. "But not committing?" "Not yet." Rommel lowered his binoculars. "They're waiting for us to react. They want us to charge. They want a head-on fight." He turned to his staff. "We will give them nothing." Rommel ordered his units to reposition not toward the British, but sideways across the dunes, slipping into the darkness like a shadow. The movement was nearly silent, engines throttled low, headlights blacked out, tracks muffled by sand. The Afrika Korps slid around the British formation, slowly tightening into a wide arc that would place them in an ideal flanking position when dawn came. Rommel's plan was not to meet the Grants head-on, but to shift the entire geometry of the battlefield. By sunrise, he wanted the British to realize their line was facing the wrong direction. He stood with his arms crossed, listening to the reports as each company reached new positions. The radio crackled softly in the background. Panzer III Company in place. 88mm battery concealed. Recon elements holding flank. Artillery ready. Bayerlein approached quietly. Field Marshal, the British are holding formation. They haven't noticed our movement. They will, Rommel said, but not until it is too late. Dawn in the desert was always a moment of clarity. Long, sharp shadows stretched across the dunes. Colours returned slowly, deepening from black to violet to pale blue, and with the morning sun came the illumination of everything good and bad that had been hidden in the night. The British tanks were still lined up, facing the wrong direction. The Grants were in hull-down positions behind a ridge, their 75mm guns aimed toward an empty stretch of desert Rommel had deliberately abandoned hours earlier. They were ready for an attack that was no longer coming, and then the sun glinted off steel. The British saw it. Too late. A flash of movement. A silhouette where no silhouette should be. Rommel's armour appeared like ghosts rising out of the sand, moving quickly, aggressively, driving straight for the British flank exactly where the Grant's side armour was weakest. Now, Rommel said calmly, and the desert exploded. The first shots came from German 50mm guns, striking the sides of Crusaders and Matildas with violent clarity. British tanks scrambled to turn. Grant crews shouted inside their cramped hulls. Engines roared. Turrets rotated. But they were designed for frontal duels, not sideways brawls. And the Grant's hull-mounted gun, so deadly when facing forward, was useless to the flank. One Grant tried to rotate the entire vehicle. Another attempted to back up the ridge. A third fired wildly, the shot sailing over a Panzer III, but the Germans had come too close, too fast. Rommel's Panzer III companies penetrated deep into the British formation, slicing between tank groups, spreading confusion. Units that had rehearsed defensive lines now found themselves turning in circles, struggling to reposition. A British commander shouted into his radio, "Where is the fire from the 75? We have no lane of fire." Another voice crackled back. "Gun cannot depress the Germans R2. Close." Rommel watched the chaos unfold from a ridge, calm and unblinking. "This," he said, "is how we fight them." But the battle was not one-sided. After the initial shock, the British regained their footing. A pair of Grants managed to pull back over the ridge, giving them the elevation they desperately needed. From that position, the 75mm guns could finally see targets, and they fired. The first shell tore through a Panzer III, lifting its turret slightly as smoke poured from the hull. The second ripped into a recon vehicle. A third tracked a Panzer IV, shearing metal and wrenching the vehicle sideways. Rommel lowered his binoculars slowly. "They learn quickly," he muttered. The British were adapting on the fly, repositioning the Grants into broader arcs, angling their hulls for maximum depression, using elevation to regain frontal fire capability. Rommel turned to his staff. "Shift south 500 meters, he ordered. "Force them to move again. If they stay still, their guns win. If they move, ours do." The Germans began shifting, and the British followed. Then the Germans cut sideways, and the British followed again. The desert became a chessboard, one in which each side tried to manipulate movement and angle rather than brute force. Around mid-morning, a dust cloud appeared from the west. Rommel's binoculars snapped up. British reinforcements. More Crusaders. More infantry trucks. More artillery to weigh down the line. And among them more Grants. Not many. 4, maybe 5. But enough. Enough that the British regained their confidence. A British officer shouted into his radio, Push them now!" Grant tanks crested the ridge together, guns already depressed, engines rumbling. The 75mm cannons opened fire in a rolling wave. One Panzer III was knocked completely onto its side by a direct hit. Another was pierced through the engine block, smoke billowing out. A third disappeared in a flash of flame. The Afrika Korps wavered. Rommel's jaw set like stone. "Bring up the 88 seconds, he said. It was not a suggestion, not a request. It was the lever that would decide the battle. Two 88mm guns rolled into position behind the ridge, concealed in folds of sand, their long barrels elevation level and deadly. Crews moved with practiced speed. Rommel stood behind them, hands on his hips. "Pick the ones with the highest elevation," he said. "They are guiding the rest." The gunners adjusted. Rommel raised his hand. "Fire." The first 88mm shell crossed the desert like a white-hot whisper. It struck a Grant dead center, the explosion peeling the turret upward as if a giant hand had ripped it open. The second 88mm fired a split second later, smashing into another Grant and punching through both sides of the hull. The British line faltered. A third 88mm shot landed, detonating a fuel store. The Grants began reversing, their hulls belching smoke, and the British assault collapsed into disorder. Rommel watched quietly. "Even strong tanks," he said, "have stronger enemies." By midday, the battle was over. The British retreated in a long, uneven withdrawal, some tanks towing others, some limping on damaged tracks, some rolling back in smoke and silence. The Afrika Korps held the field. German mechanics recovered another, Grant damaged but intact, adding to the growing list of captured equipment. Rommel stood near the disabled tank, listening to reports. Losses. Moderate. Enemy losses. Heavier. Position. Secured. A lesser commander might have celebrated. Rommel did not. He placed a hand on the warped hull of the newly captured Grant. "We won today," he said, "but not because they were weak." He turned to his officers. "We won because they used these tanks incorrectly." His voice lowered. "And they will not make that mistake again." The desert wind swept across the battlefield, carrying with it the heat of burned oil and the faint, metallic tang of shattered armor. The Afrika Korps moved among the wrecks, victorious for now. But Rommel's mind was already on the next battle. Because the Americans were awake, their machines were arriving, and the Grant was just the beginning. The coded transmission left Afrika Korps headquarters just after midnight. Lieutenant Kruger, the signals officer, watched the last burst of encrypted characters vanish into the ether and exhaled deeply. Every message they sent back to Berlin carried weight battles counted in fuel drums, casualties counted in handwriting, and requests counted in patience. But this message was different. This one contained a warning, and Kruger knew exactly what that meant. Rommel had dictated the text himself. Standing over the signals table with a lantern casting sharp shadows across his face, the field marshal spoke in short, clipped sentences. No poetic flourishes, no complaints. Just a precise summary of what he had seen when he inspected the captured M3 Grant. "This American tank," he said, "poses a serious threat to current Panzer formations. Recommend immediate review of armament parity. Current Panzer III and early Panzer IV, insufficient in head-on engagements." The key sentence hit Berlin hardest. If delivered in large numbers, this vehicle could overmatch Afrika Korps frontline units. Kruger had transmitted dozens of reports before, but he had never seen Rommel personally supervise one, nor had he ever seen the field marshal revise a line twice before approving it. Rommel understood how Berlin interpreted his messages. He understood that his words could be read as either strategic insight or criticism. And Rommel had just said, in effect, "America has built something we aren't prepared to fight." That was not a comfortable message for the German High Command. So the signals officer had watched the message disappear into the airwaves with a sense of apprehension, as if he had released something that couldn't be reeled back. He didn't have to wait long for the consequences. Around 14 hours after the message had been sent, a dusty courier motorcycle roared into the Afrika Korps forward headquarters. The rider saluted, delivered a sealed envelope, and remained in rigid posture until Rommel dismissed him. Major Westphal slit the envelope and scanned the first lines. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Field Marshal," he said, "Berlin received your report." Rommel looked up from the maps he was marking. "I assume they have questions?" Westphal hesitated. "They have opinions." Rommel extended his hand. The major passed the telegram. Rommel unfolded it, reading the crisp, precise German script, the tone unmistakable. Polite, cautious, balancing respect for a field commander who had become a national icon with bureaucratic discomfort. The situation assessment regarding new Anglo-American armor is acknowledged. Current ordnance rearmament schedules remain fixed. Panzer IV, F2 deliveries to Afrika Korps will continue as planned. Further evaluation required before adjustments to doctrine. Rommel exhaled slowly through his nose. They did not reject his warning, but they did not act decisively either. Typical. The rest of the telegram contained familiar language: maintain initiative, economize fuel, avoid unnecessary engagements, expect British activity at El Adem and Bir el Gubi. But the paragraph Rommel kept, rereading, was the one that attempted to soothe him. Grant tank performance is considered transitional. Forthcoming German armor designs will address long-term parity. Rommel tapped the page twice. Transitional, he murmured. They think this is just another stopgap. Westphal stood by the table, waiting. He knew that something more important was forming in Rommel's mind. The field marshal's eyes weren't angry, they were calculating. What will be your reply, sir? Rommel folded the telegram and slipped it under a map weight. None, he said. Westphal blinked. None? Rommel turned back to the map. Berlin believes they understand the desert. They do not. I have learned that when Berlin believes too strongly, a reply only hardens their assumptions. He made a sweeping gesture across the map, tracing the coming British concentration. It is not Berlin that must understand the grant, it is us. If Berlin won't adjust their doctrine, we will adjust ours. 2 days later, units from the 15th Panzer Division assembled outside an abandoned caravanserai east of Tobruk. The sun was a white-hot coin in the sky. Men stood in the narrow strips of shade cast by their vehicles, waiting for the reason they had been ordered to gather. Rommel arrived with a small convoy. Officers saluted, mechanics stepped aside, and crews straightened. Rumours had travelled quickly that Rommel had captured a new American tank, that he had said something radical about it, that Berlin had ignored him. What he said next would spread even faster. Rommel climbed onto the roof of a Panzer III Osf. J. Dust swirled around his boots. He shielded his eyes with one hand and surveyed the men. You have seen British tanks before, he began. You have fought them, Crusaders, Matildas, Valentines. You have beaten all of them. Men nodded silently. Rommel continued. But today you must learn something new. The British are receiving American tanks. They are called Grants. They are ugly, they are awkward, and they are dangerous. He let the words hang. Rommel signalled to a team of mechanics. They brought forward the captured Grant, still scraped and scuffed from its last battle. A murmur went through the assembled crews, some amused at its tall silhouette, others wary of its imposing gun. Rommel pointed at the 75mm cannon. This gun is the reason I called you here. He stepped aside, so all could see. This gun can penetrate a Panzer III at distances where you cannot penetrate it. This gun can fire from hull-down positions we cannot match. This gun is your new teacher. He pulled a binocular case from his belt and set it aside. You will study this tank today, not with arrogance, with respect. Then he motioned to his staff. Bring out the demonstration rig. The demonstration rig consisted of a makeshift target, a thick stack of spaced armor plates suspended on wooden frames. A German tanker shouted, "We're using their gun to test our armor?" Rommel nodded. Exactly. The Grant's captured gun crew, volunteers from an artillery unit familiar with American designs, climbed in, loaded a shell, and prepared to fire. Rommel addressed the panzer crews one last time. When a new weapon arrives, the enemy has the first advantage. Knowledge is how we take it back. He stepped aside and raised his hand. Fire! The 75mm cannon cracked with a deep, stomach-felt concussion. Dust leapt from the ground. The shell slammed into the target plates, punching through the first 2 layers, splitting the wood frame, and burying itself in the sand beyond. A stunned hush fell over the German crews. Rommel gestured to the torn armour. "This is what you face at medium range." He turned toward the Panzer III formations. "And this," he said, pointing to the Panzer armour they relied on, "is not enough. Not head-on. Silence. Shock. And then the dawning understanding of what this really meant. One commander finally spoke. "How should we engage them, Field Marshal?" Rommel reached into the dust and picked up a shard of metal. "With this knowledge," he said, "you will change your habits. You will fight these machines like hunters, not duelists." He outlined the new instructions, sharp, practical, drilled into every tanker present. Rommel lowered the metal shard. "Survival in the desert," he said, "belongs not to the strongest, but to the quickest to adapt." That evening, after the demonstration, Rommel retired to his command tent. Westphal entered with an additional note from Berlin, a longer one this time. "They sent analysis from the Ordnance Office," he said. Rommel took the papers and read silently. The Ordnance Office insisted the Grant's armour was mediocre, that the gun was outdated, that German optical sights were superior, and that German anti-tank weapons compensated for any weakness. Rommel folded the paper once, then twice, then placed it on the table. "They are analysing this like a European battlefield," he said. Westphal nodded. "Not like Africa." Rommel paced slowly. "In Europe, a tall tank is a disadvantage. In the desert, height allows earlier spotting. In Europe, armour thickness decides a duel. In the desert, flanking decides everything. In Europe, ranges are short. In the desert, ranges stretch across kilometres." He tapped the tent pole. "The Grant is not superior because it is a great tank. It is superior because the desert favours its gun." He poured a small measure of water from his canteen, barely a sip, and drank. "And Berlin cannot see it because they are blinded by their own doctrine." Westphal looked at him as though expecting the next order. Instead, Rommel simply said, "We will fight with what we have, and we will compensate for what Berlin refuses to acknowledge." By the end of the week, reconnaissance reports confirmed movement across a wide front. The British were massing forces, again, tanks, trucks, artillery. Something large was building near the Gazala line. As the British reorganised, the first units equipped with new Grants rolled into position. Some crews were inexperienced with them, others sceptical of their strange layout. But British tank commanders understood one thing clearly. They finally had a gun that could trade blows with the Germans. In one British squadron tent, a captain leaned over a map, tapping the area where they expected to meet the Afrika Korps. "These machines may look bizarre," he said to his men, "but the Americans put real teeth in them, and Rommel won't underestimate them." He was right, because even now, far across the sand, Rommel stood over his own map, studying the same stretch of ground. The wind rattled the tent flaps, the lantern flickered. A pencil lay across the map like a thin dagger. Once again, he was preparing for a fight against odds. He knew Berlin wouldn't reinforce him quickly. He knew supplies would arrive in a trickle. He knew the British had momentum. And now they had the Grant. Rommel murmured to himself, "War rewards those who learn the fastest." "We will see," he said softly. "Who learns fastest this time?" Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.